Hey, what's up, Gang Green Nation? All my Jets fans, it's Thomas Christopher, aka Tommy Jets, here with, of course, Rivka Boord, a colleague of mine, and she also is the host of the Score Board on the JetsXFactor YouTube channel. Rivka, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. The Jets, hey, they're right into training camp. They're actually about to start their joint practices pretty soon. What have been your takeaways so far in training camp up to this point with the Jets?
So the first thing I just said, normally you want to kind of see a back and forth. This year, I really wanted to see the offense just dominate like that. I want to see the offense do well, and that kind of hasn't been the case. I mean, there definitely have been some kinks to work out. So to me, it's just like one of my takeaways is that they may not be so fresh against San Francisco. Like as much as okay, that hopefully everyone will be healthy. That offense may need some time to gel, which is kind of what we thought. But I was kind of hoping to see more cohesiveness. Another takeaway of mine is just how reliant this receiving core is going to be on Garrett Wilson. Now I know they don't have Mike Williams, but still the just that receiving is really going to run through Garrett, which I know we knew, but again, like seeing it in action, just how much that's the case, like it just emphasizes how important he is. And then I guess some of the other like more fringe players, because we really know what their roster is going to look like, right? But like we know the core of what it's going to look like. So it's really looking at some of the guys who may not have gotten as much playing time, but getting some takeaways about that. Like let's say, Will McDonald, people have been kind of concerned about him to an extent. I'm not as concerned, but I'm just saying, like you want to see how he's doing. There's been a lot of talk about Jamie Sherwood and how he's looked good in practice recently. So that's something that's always good to see, especially if one of the top linebackers gets injured. Even Quantez Stiggers, we've heard a lot of good stuff about him, some breaking up some passes. Trying to think who else, like how Olu Fashanu was doing. So these are some things that I'm just, kind of looking at. And I feel like, at least from some of them, like we've definitely gotten some positive updates.
Yeah, actually, I love that. Jamie Sherwood is a guy that I really wanted to keep an eye on because he's proven in the run game that he does well, but he was probably one of the worst coverage linebackers last season. So it's been nice to see him kind of improve on that aspect, at least so far during camp. The wide receiver thing is interesting, right? Because Xavier Gipson went down, so that really forced Alan Lazard into a bigger role, forced Malachi Corley probably into a bigger role in camp, and some of these like fringe guys like Brownlee and Harrell and Taylor as well. It's really interesting to see how that works out because I mean you kind of hit the nail on the head. It's like Garrett Wilson and then there's everybody else. So that kind of worries me a little bit. And tying into that next question, actually I have for you is what position group or players have worried you so far in this training camp?
I mean, so I have to say wide receiver, but obviously it's hard to know just without Mike Williams because again, like there's just so much hinging on him. And like if he's good, the receiving core will be great. If he's mediocre, the receiving core already has questions. If he's not close to himself, then we're like looking at a 2023 situation all over again, albeit with Rodgers at quarterback. The position group that I was most concerned about, honestly, was interior defensive line. The problem is that, beyond Quinnen, the problem is that you just can't really get so much of a feel for that in training camp because it's not the same as like real hardcore trench play. And so you hear things, you hear Lucky Fotu sometimes, oh, he did a good job on this play. I think today Leonard Taylor had a nice play. It tipped a pass in training camp. But for the most part, I feel like that's my biggest concern going into the season. Obviously, safety is just in general like a position that there's not a lot. Like you have Chuck Clark coming off an ACL. You have Tony Adams, kind of who was average-ish, maybe somewhat below average as a in his first year as a starter. So you don't really know what you're getting there. And again, we haven't heard much about them in practice, at least from what's coming out. So it's hard to know what you're going to see. And then other than that, it's really backup interior offensive line. They have Wes Schweitzer, and then what? They're trusting Max Mitchell to be their backup guard? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, I'm really hoping that interior offensive line has some more parts that can contribute if somebody has to go down with an injury, which God forbid that happens. I'm really hoping that they pick somebody up in free agency to at least make it competitive. And I think you made a really great point about the defensive line because, Eric Watts has supposedly had a great training camp. Leonard Taylor's shown flashes, and Javon Kinlaw and Solomon Thomas apparently have also had a great camp. But that's the thing; it's only in camp, so it's kind of hard to see how that adjusts going forward. I think we'll find out a lot about that. And I also agree with the safety point. I wanted to actually ask you a question. Do you think how much do you think that ACL affects Chuck Clark this season? Because he was more of a physical guy,
So in theory, I think that it should affect him less than other players simply because he never relied on his speed. He was much more of an instincts kind of guy, and reading the field well. But there are two problems that I could see with it. Number one, the Jets, he was more of a box safety with the Ravens. The Jets play Adams in the box a lot more than people think. Like, he's not your traditional free safety by any stretch, which means that Clark might play deep a lot more than maybe people expect. And if that's the case, the speed element is going to be more important than it might have been with the Ravens. And so that concerns me. The other thing is just, I think he's 28 or 29. If his speed was already declining just due to age, and then you take the ACL on top of that, I'm definitely concerned about it. I think he'll still be a good player, but I have a lot more questions about him than I did last year coming in when he was one of my favorite. I think he was my favorite Joe Douglas pickup last season.
Yeah, no, I love Clark on the Ravens too. Do you think there's a chance that the three of them, including Ashton Davis and Tony Adams, that there's that they kind of get a merry-go-round, so to speak, depending on packages? Do you think that they're moved interchangeably depending on the scheme and look?
So I think Adams and Clark will always be on the field, pretty much. I think Davis will come in and out and may shift positions. I don't necessarily love it. I think Davis should be only a sub linebacker box type guy because I'm really concerned about him deep. But I think that's what they would do. They would put interchange Davis deep, Clark deep, Adams deep, kind of moving parts, which we've seen to an extent for the last 2 years. Now in 2022 was much more LaMarcus Joyner playing deep on every play, and then sometimes Whitehead high and sometimes low. But last year they rotated a fair amount, so I could see in particular Clark and Davis kind of swapping out.
Yeah, I know personally that's one thing that I'm really looking for is that back end during their preseason game against Washington on Saturday. And what are you looking for in that game, and what kind of prediction do you have as the game unfolds?
So I'm looking for, I think I kind of mentioned it before, it's just this obviously going to be backups. I want to see who stands out. So Olu, how does Olu perform? I'm assuming he's gonna play a lot of reps. Who stands out at interior offensive line? Because we know Schweitzer will be on the team for better or for worse, mostly for worse, and particularly if he ever has to play center because he's a pretty bad center. We're talking about Joe Tippmann snaps. Did you watch Wes Schweitzer last year in training camp? Did you watch him in the preseason? His snapping is awful. So he's a different story, but who else stands out? They have this whole pack of guards, right? Xavier Newman, Chris Glazer, Jake Hansen, who I know has got injured. They've been playing Mitchell at some guard. They have Brady Latham, the UDFA. So it's kind of and then I know Cole, I don't even know how to pronounce his last name, Loveo, the guy from the UFL. The UFL guy, so we don't know where he's going to play necessarily. So that's a position group that I'm keeping a close eye on, the interior offensive line. I'm interested in what's going to happen to kick returner. I mean, that's obviously a big competition. I actually just talked about this. I wrote an article about Xavier Gibson and his kick returning from last year. And if you watch a film, you assume when you talk about a kick returner, that it's just what the blocking gave them, especially last year, right? When all the rules were very much in favor of just touchbacks and it was hard to kind of return. You watch his film and you realize just how bad he was. I mean, there were so many times where he had a seam or all he had to do was just put a move on one guy and he would have had a nice game. And he doesn't even try. He just runs straight outside. And so given that, I really want to see what the other returners can do. I don't even want to see Gibson get reps at kick returner, to be honest. I want to see Malachi Corley. I want to see Isaiah Davis. I want to see Braylon Allen, Codrington, Harrell, whichever other guys they want to put back there. I don't want Gibson taking any of those reps because, in my opinion, like let him be the punt returner. I don't want him to kick returner. So that's another position of interest to me.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with you on the kick returner thing. I think, especially with the way things have been coming in camp so far, that the coaching staff really wants an emphasis on people who have like a ball carrier vision and are able to decipher, how the blocks are unfolding in front of them. I don't think Gibson is the best at that, as you alluded to. I really love the interior offensive line pick, as we talked about before. Kind of interesting, Schweitzer actually. I was at practice last Tuesday, and Schweitzer actually got replaced for Brady Latham on a couple of center snaps. And Latham, he did pretty good on a stunt. He did well. I mean, he's the UDFA guy, so I would like to see him. I always root for those players. I would like to see how he does. Do you have a prediction on the game? I know the game score doesn't matter as much, because it's preseason, a bunch of backups. Who do you think ends up winning there? I think Jaden Daniels is going to play if that makes a difference. So, what's your take on that?
I mean, look, the Jets seem to win in preseason. That seems to be the pattern. And usually it's like the double backups who are like causing them to win. So I have no reason to doubt that will happen. Now, the Jets made Bryce Young look pretty bad last year in the preseason. I don't think Jaden Daniels is quite Bryce Young. But then again, I don't know if the Commanders are going to play their starting offensive line. But even if they do, their offensive line has a lot of holes. So I could imagine Daniels running for his life, even with this Jets second team defense on the field. Then again, they also play as vanilla a cover 3, as you could imagine in the preseason. So maybe that just makes it easier for him and he can find his guys. But I think that somehow they'll win. I don't really care how. I'm more interested in who plays and how they do. And again, to a certain extent, remember a couple of years ago, people were talking about how Bryce Hall got, beaten in the preseason over and over again. Like, they're playing as easy a cover 3 to decipher as you can ever imagine. What do you think is going to happen in a lot of these plays? Like, they're going to find the hole in the cover 3, and they're just going to keep hitting it over and over again. So the cornerbacks are going to look bad.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's kind of, it's so interesting too, like being from the analytical side and actually understanding some stuff as opposed to what the average fan sees and how they react to certain things too. The contrast is very, let's say fun is the word that I will use. And also not Jets related. I'm really interested in seeing my man Luke McCaffrey. I actually talked to him at the Senior Bowl. One of the greatest kids I've ever met. So humble. Of course, his family, Christian McCaffrey and his father, Ed, NFL stars. But yeah, I love that. So one player who isn't going to be there and might not even be there on week 1 is Mike Williams, who we talked a little bit about. What do you for a player that doesn't rely so much on his route running, the ACL I feel like is a little more damaging to him than compared to most players, especially at his age. How do you see that injury affecting him and that impact he has on the season when he gets, eased into the lineup and things of that nature?
So I agree with you 100%. The ACL might be more of an issue because he relies on his leaping. And like just being able to plant and leap and then coming down on it could also really be an impact. Again, he's not a speed guy, so I guess in that sense it's not such an issue. But also we see that contested catch skill kind of diminish. You'd think that it's the speed guys who fall off the most drastically, but actually the data shows that it's the contested catch ability that seems to dissipate when the receivers first start to go, and those guys tend to plummet rather drastically. So between his ACL tear and his age, there's definitely a significant risk that he could fall off a cliff this season. Now, I don't think it's going to happen, and I certainly hope it doesn't happen, but there is a risk. Now, in terms of, I've just wondered in general, Williams tore his ACL in week 3 last year. In 2022, Breece Hall tore his ACL in week 7. Breece Hall was ready for week 1, but they eased him into the lineup. I'm kind of curious why Williams isn't a month ahead of where Hall was in his, I keep saying this and I haven't heard any response. Now, the thing I can think of is his age. Obviously, Hall was younger and much more athletic, so the recovery time is different. But still, I was kind of like, he got hurt pretty early in the season. Like, why is he still on that Breece Hall timeline? That kind of makes you wonder just about how his recovery is going, even if Rodgers happened to have said he's ahead of schedule. I definitely think Allen Lazard will take his spot on a lot of plays early in the season because people keep talking about, Malik Taylor made the roster because they need to ease Williams. And I was like, Taylor's a slot guy. He's not taking Mike Williams' place. It's Lazard who's taking Mike Williams' place. That if Williams is not there, what it means is that Garrett Wilson will not be able to play in the slot that often. Because in the way I saw them kind of lining up their 11 personnel a lot was trying to put Williams and Lazard on the outside with Garrett in the slot. They're not going to be able to do that as much if Williams isn't there. Although, look, they played Garrett in the slot about a third of the time last year, a little less. So they're still going to get their reps with it, but that just means that they have some other lesser receiver on the outside. Like last year, they played Xavier Gibson on the outside probably more than they should have.
Yeah, no, I agree. So the thing that concerns me, because I have the same type of concerns about Mike Williams as you do, then the thing that kind of concerns me is a player who I wouldn't say necessarily is at Williams' level in terms of talent, but in terms of gameplay is like Michael Gallup. And we saw Michael Gallup tear his ACL, and he retired this year. And saw a drastic decline in his production as well prior to the retirement. And they kind of have a pretty similar game in terms of contested catches, the routes they kind of ran, kind of the same usage as well. So that worries me a little bit. It also worries me based on how, interchangeable these wide receivers are going to be if Mike Williams isn't available. I think we're going to kind of see basically the same sort of offense we saw last season, which doesn't get me too excited, but at the same time, I mean, we have Garrett Wilson and he's a stud. So I'm hoping that it turns out a little bit differently, especially, of course, with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. It should be a lot better than Zach Wilson. I've been going through some of Garrett Wilson's film, and it's just kind of hilarious seeing them do, play action passes and just seeing Zach Wilson either get sacked while, Garrett or somebody's running free, or he just does a check down to Brees because he can't read past that. So I know it'll be a lot better than that. I just don't know how much better it'll be. So one other thing I wanted to talk to you about, is the Jets have to make a lot of decisions at the end of the season on a lot of players. To be frank, some of these guys just aren't going to be here this season. So after this season, sorry. So what players do you think could potentially find themselves off of the team this year, either from a contract standpoint or a diminished level of play standpoint?
So, I mean, the two obvious ones are Tyron Smith and Mike Williams. I mean, they were signed to one-year deals. The Jets drafted Smith's successor. So, Ola will be starting week 1 next year, barring, a disastrous, kind of output. Smith, if he plays well, he'll play himself out of a contract with the Jets. If he doesn't play well, they're not going to want to re-sign him. So then, so Williams is just, Smith is as gone as they are. Ditto for Mike Williams to a large extent. If he plays well, he's going to want, more money than the Jets can give him. And if he doesn't play well, the Jets don't want him back. So those two are obvious. Now, what people seem not to notice is that I don't know if Rodgers is even under contract for next year. I know that there's a number, or maybe he is under contract. It's just not guaranteed. I think his cap number is though like $49 million next year. So obviously, look, he could choose to retire. He says he has 1 or 2, years left. But if this year goes terribly, you could see him just hanging it up, especially if he gets injured again. And so, look, I don't think it's going to happen. I think Rodgers will be with them for another year, but not a guarantee. As far as other players who might not be with the Jets, I thought CJ Mosley wouldn't ride out his contract with the Jets just because I thought his money was way too high for what he was giving them. But he he signed a new contract, and so I think they put void years in there, so his cap number is pretty reasonable next year. And as long as he continues even the level of play, which I think he's a bit overrated at this point among Jets fans, but he's still good enough to play middle linebacker, and he's the captain of the defense. So I think he'll be back. But again, if you see his play decline, there's potential that they could let him go and let the problem is that Sherwood's also a free agent. So if Sherwood, let's say, comes in, Mosley gets hurt, or God forbid, or something like that, and then Sherwood, it's like, well, Sherwood's a free agent too. So that's a bit of a question. I think DJ Reed is all but gone. I think he said as much. Like, he didn't say it outright, but he said, like, look, my contract was 3 years. I expect to be here 3 years and then hit free agency. Jets are not going to be able to sign both Reed and Carter. And I don't understand why they haven't like had any
Talk to
contract
Carter.
talks with
Yeah.
Carter. Like I think they should be. I think it would be really foolish of Joe Douglas not to. Like it was one thing with Bryce off last year where you could say, you know, he had only played 16% of the snaps, so maybe you don't believe in him. But we know what Carter is at this point. And so they should be talking contract to him now. Now they could always do it during the season before, you know, well before he actually hits the market. But you don't want a player like that tested. And so DJ Reed, I think, is probably the most obvious one. Now it's Tony Adams is an interesting one because he's in the final year of his contract, but they have the tender, right? They can give him, because he only has 3 years of service, he'll be a restricted free agent after the season. So technically they can offer him a tender. Now, because he was an undrafted free agent, they can't give him the original round tender, right? Like a 5th or 6th round pick, you put an original round tender on them, you know, and a lot of times you can get away with that. So realistically with Adams, it would either be a 2nd round tender or a right of first refusal tender. 2nd round would mean that if any team signed him, they would need to give up a 2nd round pick. And then right of first refusal means the Jets could basically match any offer. But they wouldn't get any compensation if he left, but they could match an offer that a different team gave him. Now the problem is the 2nd round tender is a little high. I mean, it's not terrible. It's like somewhere around 4.5, 5 million, but it might be higher than the Jets want to give Adams depending on how he performs. So he could be a sneaky one. Like they could be looking for 2 new safeties next season because Clark's on a 1-year deal. So that's one to definitely look out for. Trying to think who else might not be with him next year. I mean, you know, Morstead is on a 1-year deal. I imagine they'll keep signing him until he retires, but who knows?
Yeah.
I think those are the main ones that come to mind immediately that might not be on the team.
Yeah, it's a lot. I know it's a lot more than fans definitely realize. I really love the Aaron Rodgers call. I've been talking about that too. Like, I don't think too many people. I know nobody wants to speak negativity into existence, but you know, heaven forbid, you know, the Jets have a terrible season. Rodgers could be directly out the door, and then stuff gets a lot, you know, more perilous for the Jets. I guess I would say. You know, I'm not too worried, like you said, but it's still something to think about. Also, I completely agree about the Michael Carter thing. I talked about it on my show last week, actually. I don't even understand. Rich Samini said as late as June that they haven't even spoken to his representatives yet. I'm hoping now that we're in August, it's a little bit different and they've at least reached out because it's not a good look to have, you know, we saw the numbers that Michael Carter's, he's the best slot nickelback in the NFL right now. He's putting up the same type of coverage numbers as Sauce Gardner out of the slot. It's incredible. And he's only 25 years old. So it's something that the Jets, I think, really need to lock him down. And I think Reed is gone too. Reed and Tyron Smith seem like the 2 guys that are most likely they probably won't be here. And I really would like to see the Jets bring another receiver in if they let Mike Williams walk. I'm not sure how I feel about Corley taking over like a wide receiver 2 role yet. I think he's more basically just like a slot guy. He still has a lot that he needs to develop on the route running end. So I was going to end the show on that, but I figured, hey, let's end it on something positive instead. So instead of looking at the guys who, you know, might not be on the team next year, this season specifically, you know, what's one player or position group that you think needs to step up and will have, you know, help the Jets have a great chance of, you know, potentially locking up their first playoff berth in, you know, over 10 years.
I mean, I think the offensive line, I think that just has to be like there's the potential there to be at the very worst, a top 10 unit, or top 12, something like that. So, you know, it might take a little bit of time to gel, but I mean, look, I like certainly at least 4 of the players on the line, if not all 5. And so I think that if they step up and even if they just get average offensive line play, like, I mean, with Breece Hall back there, all he needs is one good offensive lineman and he's off to the races. I think that nationally, Breece Hall has kind of not gotten enough love, at least in certain segments, you know. So I think that having him and Aaron Rodgers where they're playing more too high, I feel like if the offensive line is just decent, the Jets could be in for a very big offensive year, even if Mike Williams isn't the Mike Williams we've seen previously.
I love that. And, you know, God forbid, you know, Tyron Smith or Moses get hurt. At least they have a potential backup option in Olu Fashanu. Hopefully we see the Jets have their first playoff birth, and since the Rex Ryan years. I know I would love that, and I'm sure you would love it too. Rivka, I appreciate you being on the show. For everybody listening, that's Rivka Boord at RIVKA_BOORD on Twitter. She works at JetsXFactor. She also hosts the Score Boord on JetsXFactor YouTube podcast. Rivka, is there any other comments or anything you'd like to let Jets fans know before we head out of here?
I think you covered it. I would just say also you could check out the scoreboard wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, make sure you guys check that out. And as always, it's Thomas Christopher, aka Tommy Jets. Thank you for having us, and until next time.